What if I told you that the soldier everyone said was too broken to serve would end up being the only person who could save them all? This is the story of Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, whose military file was stamped unfit for duty until the day her former commander realized she was their only hope. The morning fog clung to Fort Brazelton like a shroud, rolling across the sprawling Army base in North Carolina as Colonel Marcus Webb made his way through the corridors of the Strategic Intelligence Command building. The familiar weight of his security badge bounced against his chest with each step, a rhythm he'd grown accustomed to over 23 years of service. But today, something felt different. Today marked exactly 18 months since he'd been forced to make the hardest decision of his military career. The classified briefing room on the 3rd floor remained unchanged since that devastating day. In March 2023, same sterile white walls, same reinforced steel door, same biometric scanner that had recorded Elena Vasquez's final authorized entry. Webb paused outside the room, his weathered hand hovering over the access panel. Inside this room, he'd watched one of the most brilliant tactical minds he'd ever encountered completely unravel during what should have been a routine intelligence assessment. Elena had been his best cyber warfare analyst, a prodigy who could decode enemy communications faster than most seasoned veterans could read them. Her ability to predict terrorist attack patterns from digital footprints had saved countless lives across 3 combat deployments. She possessed an almost supernatural gift for seeing connections in data that others missed entirely, threading together seemingly unrelated pieces of intelligence into cohesive threat assessments that consistently proved accurate. The official report, sealed in a manila folder that Webb kept locked in his desk drawer, told a different story. It described a soldier who had suffered a complete psychological breakdown during a critical mission briefing, displaying erratic behavior, paranoid delusions, and an inability to distinguish between authentic intelligence and fabricated threats. The military psychiatrists had been unanimous in their assessment. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder complicated by acute anxiety and possible paranoid schizophrenia. Their recommendation had been swift and decisive: immediate medical discharge. Classified as unfit for military service. Webb pushed open the door to the briefing room and stepped inside. The space felt hollow without Elena's presence, like a library with all the books removed. Her workstation remained exactly as she'd left it that day, computer terminal wiped clean according to security protocols, but her personal coffee mug still sitting beside the keyboard. The mug bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, a unit she'd never served with directly but had provided crucial intelligence support during their most dangerous operations. A small crack ran down one side, the result of Elena nervously setting it down too hard during particularly intense analysis sessions. No one had been willing to remove Elena's personal effects from the briefing room. Her replacement, a competent but unremarkable analyst named Lieutenant Peters, had requested a different workstation rather than disturb what the younger soldiers had begun calling Vasquez's shrine. The coffee mug, a small succulent plant she'd kept alive despite the room's lack of natural light, and a faded photograph tucked into the corner of her monitor frame. These items had become unofficial monuments to a career that had ended too abruptly and too controversially. The photograph showed Elena standing with her analysis team after successfully preventing a major terrorist attack on a military convoy in Afghanistan. She stood in the center of the group, wearing her standard-issue desert camouflage uniform, her dark hair pulled back in regulation style. But it was her eyes that Webb remembered most clearly, sharp, focused, alive with the intellectual intensity that had made her such an exceptional intelligence analyst. In the photo, she was smiling, but even then Webb could see the weight she carried. Every successful prediction meant lives saved, but it also meant she'd stared into the minds of people who wanted to kill American soldiers. That kind of work left marks that didn't show up in medical examinations. Webb had argued against Elena's discharge with every tool at his disposal. He'd submitted formal appeals, requested secondary psychological evaluations, and even gone above his immediate superiors to plead her case with Pentagon officials. His arguments had been consistently logical and data-driven. Elena's success rate in threat assessment exceeded departmental averages by 47%. Her analytical reports had been cited in 17 successful counter-terrorism operations, and her tactical insights had prevented an estimated 320 casualties over her 6-year career. But logic hadn't been enough to override medical recommendations and bureaucratic concerns about liability. The Army's position had been clear. A soldier who could no longer distinguish between real and imagined threats posed a danger to herself and others. Elena's final security clearance review had been particularly damaging. During what should have been a routine update briefing, she had presented an elaborate analysis connecting seemingly unrelated cyber attacks to a coordinated enemy operation that military intelligence insisted didn't exist. Her presentation had been meticulously researched, filled with cross-reference data points and timeline correlations that demonstrated her usual analytical brilliance. But her conclusions had contradicted every official assessment, suggesting enemy capabilities and coordination that senior intelligence officials deemed impossible. The breaking point had come when Elena insisted that the cyber attack she'd been tracking were test runs for a much larger operation, one that would target critical infrastructure systems across multiple military installations simultaneously. Her voice had grown increasingly agitated as she explained her findings, pointing to data patterns that she claimed proved enemy forces were preparing for an unprecedented digital assault on American military networks. When questioned about her sources, Elena had been unable to provide concrete evidence, instead relying on what she described as intuitive pattern recognition and predictive data modeling that existed primarily in her own analytical framework. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The psychiatric evaluation that followed had been swift and merciless. Military doctors had diagnosed Elena with stress-induced paranoia, noting her inability to distinguish between genuine intelligence patterns and conspiracy theories generated by an overworked and traumatized mind. They'd pointed to her increasing isolation from colleagues, her tendency to work 18-hour shifts without breaks, and her growing obsession with threats that existed only in her imagination. The final psychological assessment had been particularly brutal in its clinical detachment. Subject demonstrates persistent delusions of persecution, grandiose beliefs about her analytical abilities, and complete disconnection from objective reality regarding enemy capabilities and intentions. Webb closed his eyes and remembered the last conversation he'd had with Elena before her discharge. She had sat in his office, still wearing her uniform, but with her security badges already confiscated, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. Her hands had shaken slightly as she tried to explain once more why her analysis was correct, why the patterns she'd identified represented a genuine threat that everyone else was choosing to ignore. He'd wanted to believe her, had spent sleepless nights reviewing her data and trying to see the connections she claimed were obvious. But without supporting evidence from other intelligence sources, her theories had seemed increasingly detached from reality. "Colonel," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know how this looks. I know everyone thinks I've lost my mind. But the patterns are there. Someone is coordinating these attacks, testing our vulnerabilities, preparing for something bigger. I can feel it in the data like other people feel changes in the weather. Please don't let them write me off as crazy." Webb had done everything he could, but the bureaucratic machinery had already been set in motion. Elena's medical discharge had been processed with the same impersonal efficiency that characterized all military personnel decisions. Her service record had been annotated with codes that would follow her into civilian life, marking her as a veteran who had been deemed psychologically unfit for continued service. The woman who had once been consulted by generals and CIA directors had been reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of combat, stress, and occupational burnout. The irony hadn't been lost on Webb that Elena's discharge had occurred during National Military Appreciation Month, a time supposedly dedicated to honoring the service and sacrifice of American soldiers. Instead of recognition, Elena had received a medical classification that would impact her ability to find meaningful employment, qualify for certain veterans' benefits, and maintain the security clearances that had defined her professional identity. She had served her country with distinction for 6 years, prevented countless casualties through her analytical brilliance, and been rewarded with a psychiatric diagnosis that branded her as unfit for the very work she had performed with unprecedented success. Now, 18 months later, Webb found himself questioning whether the military had made a catastrophic mistake. Recent intelligence reports had begun showing patterns that seemed disturbingly familiar. Cyber attack signatures that matched analytical frameworks Elena had developed during her final months of service. The same officials who had dismissed her warnings as paranoid delusions were now scrambling to understand enemy capabilities that seemed to exceed their previous assessments of what was possible. Webb pulled out his phone and scrolled through Elena's last official report, a document he'd saved in violation of standard information security protocols. Her analysis had predicted cyber attack vectors that were now being actively exploited by enemy forces, infrastructure vulnerabilities that had recently been exposed, and coordination patterns that military intelligence was only beginning to recognize. The woman they'd dismissed as mentally unstable had apparently been the only person who truly understood what they were facing. As Webb stood in the empty briefing room, surrounded by the remnants of Elena's military career, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, the former Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez was still analyzing patterns, still connecting dots that others couldn't see, still protecting people who would never know her name. The question that haunted him wasn't whether Elena had been right about the threats she'd identified. The question was whether they would recognize their mistake in time to ask for her help when they finally realized how desperately they needed her. Lieutenant Sarah Peters adjusted her glasses for the third time in 10 minutes, squinting at the 5T data streaming across her multiple monitors in the Strategic Intelligence Command Center. The cyber threat analysis that would have taken Elena Vasquez 45 minutes to complete had consumed her entire morning, and she still wasn't confident in her conclusions. The pattern seemed obvious enough: unauthorized network probes targeting military communication systems, but something about the attack signatures felt incomplete, like she was missing crucial pieces of a larger puzzle. Colonel Webb watched from the observation deck above the analysis floor, noting how Peter's shoulders tensed with each new data point that appeared on her screens. The replacement analyst was competent, methodical, and thorough in her approach to intelligence assessment. Her background included 2 years at the National Security Agency and a master's degree in cybersecurity from Georgetown University. On paper, Lieutenant Peters should have been more than capable of filling Elena's position. In practice, the intelligence unit had been struggling with analytical gaps that seemed to grow wider with each passing week. Major Jennifer Coleman, Webb's deputy commander, joined him at the observation window carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Peters is running behind on the quarterly threat assessment again," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the analysts below couldn't hear. "This is the 3rd deadline extension she's requested this month. At this rate, we'll be submitting our intelligence reports 2 weeks after the threats have already materialized." Webb nodded grimly, remembering how Elena had consistently delivered comprehensive threat assessments days ahead of schedule. often including predictive analyses that identified emerging dangers before they appeared on anyone else's radar. The woman they discharged as mentally unstable had possessed an almost supernatural ability to synthesize vast amounts of raw intelligence data into actionable strategic insights. Her reports had been legendary throughout the intelligence community. Concise, accurate, and frequently correct about threats that seemed impossible to predict. "Peters is doing her best," Webb replied, though he could hear the lack of conviction in his own voice. Elena had 6 years of experience and an intuitive understanding of enemy tactics that took time to develop. "We can't expect her replacement to match that level of performance immediately." But even as he spoke the words, Webb knew they weren't entirely true. Elena's analytical abilities had been exceptional from her very first assignment. She'd arrived at Fort Brazelton as a newly promoted staff sergeant with barely 2 years of military intelligence experience. Yet within 6 months, she'd revolutionized their approach to cyber threat analysis. Her methods had been unconventional, relying heavily on pattern recognition and predictive modeling that seemed to border on educated guesswork. Yet her success rate had been undeniable, leading to threat interdictions that saved lives and prevented attacks that could have crippled military operations. The intelligence unit's struggles weren't limited to speed and efficiency. Their accuracy ratings had declined significantly since Elena's departure, with 3 major intelligence failures in the past year that could be directly attributed to analytical oversights. Last September, they'd missed warning signs of a coordinated cyber attack on military logistics networks, dismissing anomalous data patterns as routine system maintenance activity. The attack had disrupted supply chains for 2 weeks before cybersecurity specialists could identify and neutralize the intrusion. Elena would have recognized the attack signatures immediately, probably predicting the assault weeks before it occurred. Captain Rodriguez, the unit's senior communications analyst, approached Webb's position with a tablet displaying the latest intelligence summary. "Sir, we're seeing increased probing activity across multiple network sectors. The attack patterns don't match any known enemy profiles in our database, but the coordination suggests a sophisticated adversary with significant resources." Webb accepted the tablet and scrolled through Rodriguez's analysis, noting the careful language and cautious conclusions that characterized intelligence assessments in Elena's absence. Where Elena would have provided definitive threat evaluations and specific predictions about enemy intentions, current reports hedged every conclusion with qualifiers and uncertainties. Military commanders receiving these assessments complained privately about the lack of actionable intelligence, forcing them to make strategic decisions based on incomplete information. "What's your assessment of the threat level?" Webb asked. Knowing the answer would be frustratingly vague, Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "Without additional data points, it's difficult to determine whether these probes represent reconnaissance for a larger operation or routine intelligence gathering. The sophisticated coordination suggests state-level resources, but we can't definitively identify the source or predict their next actions." The response was professionally appropriate, but strategically useless. Elena would have provided specific threat timelines, predicted attack vectors, and identified vulnerabilities that enemy forces might exploit. Her reports had been filled with confident assertions backed by analytical reasoning that seemed almost mystical in its accuracy. Military commanders had learned to treat Elena's predictions as virtual certainties, adjusting their operational planning based on her insights about enemy intentions and capabilities. Staff Sergeant Johnson, Elena's former partner in the Cyber Analysis Division, had privately expressed concerns about their declining analytical capabilities. Johnson had worked closely with Elena for 3 years, learning to trust her intuitive approach to intelligence assessment even when her methods seemed to defy conventional analytical protocols. "She could look at raw data and see stories," Johnson had told Webb during a recent performance review. Not just what happened, but what was going to happen next. She'd point to seemingly random cyber attacks and explain how they were connected to operations planned months in advance. I used to think she was guessing, but she was right too often for it to be luck. The unit's workload had increased substantially since Elena's departure, partly due to their reduced analytical efficiency, but also because of emerging threats that seemed designed to exploit their weakened capabilities. Cyber attacks had become more frequent and sophisticated, targeting vulnerabilities that Elena might have identified and addressed proactively. Enemy forces appeared to be testing military network defenses with unprecedented boldness, as if they somehow knew that the intelligence unit's analytical capabilities had been compromised. Webb had requested additional personnel to address their analytical shortfalls, but qualified intelligence analysts were in short supply throughout the military. The few candidates available lacked Elena's combination of technical expertise and intuitive pattern recognition. Several promising analysts had been transferred to the unit temporarily, but none had demonstrated the comprehensive understanding of enemy tactics that had made Elena irreplaceable. Lieutenant Peters finally submitted her morning threat assessment, a document that would have taken Elena 30 minutes to complete, but had required 4 hours of careful analysis. Webb reviewed the report, noting its technical accuracy, but lack of predictive insight. Peters had correctly identified current threats and assessed their immediate impact on military operations, but she'd provided no analysis of enemy intentions or predictions about future attack vectors. The report answered what was happening but provided no guidance about what might happen next. The intelligence community's confidence in Fort Brazelton's analytical capabilities had eroded steadily over the 18 months since Elena's discharge. Other military intelligence units had begun conducting independent assessments of threats that would previously have been handled exclusively by Elena's team. Pentagon officials who had once relied heavily on Fort Brazelton's intelligence reports now sought confirmation from multiple sources before making strategic decisions based on their analyses. Major Coleman reviewed the latest batch of intelligence requests from field commanders, noting the increasing frequency of urgent analytical demands. "We're getting pressure from 3 different theater commands for predictive assessments of enemy cyber capabilities," she reported. "They want to know if recent attack patterns indicate preparation for larger operations, but our current analytical framework doesn't support that level of predictive modeling." Webb remembered Elena's final presentation, the one that had triggered her psychiatric evaluation and eventual discharge. She had warned about coordinated enemy operations that seemed impossible to predict using conventional intelligence methods. Her analysis had suggested that seemingly random cyber attacks were actually test runs for a much larger assault on military infrastructure systems. At the time, her conclusions had seemed paranoid and disconnected from reality. Now, watching their analytical capabilities struggle with increasingly sophisticated threats, Webb wondered if Elena had been the only person who truly understood what they were facing. The thunderstorm that rolled across Fort Brazelton at 0347 hours on Tuesday morning was unlike anything the meteorological station had predicted. Weather reports had called for partly cloudy skies with light winds, but the massive storm system that materialized over the base brought lightning strikes that seemed to target the communication towers with unnatural precision. Emergency backup generators kicked in as power fluctuations rippled through the Strategic Intelligence Command building, causing computer systems to flicker and restart in cascading waves across the analysis floors. Sergeant Davis, working the overnight shift in the communication center, initially attributed the system anomalies to electrical interference from the storm. Military installations experienced power issues during severe weather events, and emergency protocols were designed to handle temporary disruptions without compromising critical operations. But as the lightning strikes continued with mechanical regularity, always hitting the same communication arrays, Davis began to suspect that meteorological explanations might not adequately account for what was happening outside. The first sign that something more serious was occurring came from the base's cybersecurity monitoring station. Automated intrusion detection systems began registering unauthorized access attempts that coincided precisely with each lightning strike, as if the electrical interference was providing cover for sophisticated network penetration efforts. The attack signatures were unlike anything in their current threat database, displaying coordination and timing that suggested advanced knowledge of the storm's electrical patterns. Colonel Webb received the emergency notification at 0423 hours, pulling him from restless sleep in his quarters 3 miles from the command center. The duty officer's voice carried an edge of concern that cut through Webb's initial assumption that they were dealing with routine weather-related system failures. "Sir, we're seeing coordinated cyber intrusion attempts targeting our primary intelligence networks. The attacks are synchronized with lightning strikes, and our automated defenses are having difficulty distinguishing between electrical interference and deliberate system penetration." Webb dressed quickly and drove through the storm toward the command center, noting how the lightning seemed concentrated directly over the base's most sensitive communication facilities. The natural explanation was electromagnetic attraction to the tallest metal structures, but the precision and timing of the strikes created an almost artificial pattern that made his military instincts uncomfortable. During his 23 years of service, Webb had learned to trust feelings that couldn't be easily explained through standard operational procedures. Inside the Strategic Intelligence Command building, emergency lighting cast everything in harsh shadows that made the usually familiar corridors feel alien and threatening. The building's primary electrical systems were cycling between main power and backup generators, creating an intermittent humming sound that seemed to pulse in rhythm. With the lightning strikes outside, staff members moved with the urgent efficiency of personnel responding to a crisis that hadn't yet been officially classified or fully understood. Peters stood at her workstation, surrounded by printouts and laptop computers, having abandoned her usual multi-monitor setup when the power fluctuations made the main systems unreliable. Her analysis of the ongoing cyber attacks revealed patterns that seemed almost familiar, like half-remembered melodies that couldn't quite be identified. The intrusion attempts were probing specific vulnerabilities in their network architecture, testing defenses in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of Fort Brazelton's cybersecurity protocols. "Colonel," Peters called as Webb entered the analysis center, "the attack patterns are following a progression that seems designed to map our entire defensive infrastructure. They're not trying to steal data or plant malware. They're learning how our systems respond to different types of intrusion attempts, cataloging our countermeasures and identifying weaknesses we didn't know existed." Webb studied Peters' preliminary analysis, recognizing analytical insights that approached Elena's former level of strategic thinking. The pressure of the crisis was pushing Peters beyond her usual cautious approach to intelligence assessment, forcing her to make connections and draw conclusions that demonstrated capabilities she rarely displayed during routine operations. But even with her enhanced performance under stress, Webb could see gaps in the analysis that Elena would have filled instinctively. Major Coleman arrived at the command center carrying a secure communication device that had been receiving encrypted messages from Pentagon intelligence officials. The messages indicated that Fort Brazelton wasn't the only military installation experiencing coordinated cyber attacks during the storm. Similar intrusion attempts were being reported from bases across 3 different time zones, all occurring during localized weather events that provided electrical interference to mask sophisticated network penetration efforts. "It's a systematic reconnaissance operation," Coleman reported, her voice tight with the realization that they were facing something far more serious than opportunistic cyber attacks. "Someone is using weather events as cover to probe military network defenses across the entire continental United States." The coordination suggests months of preparation and resources that exceed anything we've seen from known adversaries. The attacks intensified as the storm reached its peak, with intrusion attempts becoming more aggressive and targeted. Automated defense systems that had successfully repelled earlier probes began showing signs of being overwhelmed by the volume and sophistication of the assault. What had started as reconnaissance was evolving into active attempts to penetrate classified intelligence networks, seeking access to strategic information that could compromise ongoing military operations. Worldwide. Captain Rodriguez monitored communications traffic from other affected installations, noting how the attack seemed tailored to each base's specific vulnerabilities. The adversaries weren't using generic intrusion tools, but rather customized approaches that demonstrated detailed knowledge of individual network architectures and security protocols. Such precise intelligence suggested either extensive prior reconnaissance or assistance from sources with insider access to military cybersecurity systems. Sergeant Johnson, Elena's former analytical partner, reviewed attack signatures with growing recognition that made his hands shake slightly as he cross-referenced the data. The intrusion patterns matched theoretical attack vectors that Elena had described during her final months of service, scenarios she'd claimed were being tested through seemingly random cyber attacks that intelligence officials had dismissed as unrelated incidents. The systematic approach to vulnerability assessment, the coordination across multiple installations, the use of environmental cover, all elements Elena had predicted with accuracy that had been attributed to paranoid delusion. "Sir," Johnson approached Webb with a printout displaying attack pattern analysis. "These intrusion signatures match predictive models that Staff Sergeant Vasquez developed 18 months ago. She'd identified this exact progression of reconnaissance activities, warning that random cyber attacks were actually preparation for coordinated infrastructure assessment operations." Webb felt something cold settle in his stomach as he reviewed Johnson's analysis. Elena's final presentation had described precisely this scenario: coordinated cyber attacks using weather events as cover, systematic probing of military network defenses, and reconnaissance operations designed to map vulnerabilities across multiple installations simultaneously. The psychological evaluation that had led to her discharge had specifically cited these predictions as evidence of paranoid delusions. Disconnected from operational reality, the storm continued with unnatural intensity, lightning strikes maintaining their mechanical precision as cyber attacks escalated beyond reconnaissance into active penetration attempts. Emergency protocols that had been designed to isolated incidents were proving inadequate against the coordinated assault that Elena had predicted with terrifying accuracy. As Webb watched his analysts struggle with threats that exceeded their analytical frameworks, he began to understand that Fort Brazelton's greatest intelligence asset might not have been mentally unstable after all. The woman they'd discharged as unfit for duty had apparently been the only person who truly understood what they were facing. And somewhere out there, Elena Vasquez was probably watching the same data patterns that were overwhelming his current analytical team, recognizing threats that seemed impossible to predict but were unfolding exactly as she'd warned they would. At precisely 0512 hours, as the coordinated cyber attacks reached their most aggressive phase, the secure communication line in Colonel Webb's office rang with the distinctive tone reserved for emergency Pentagon contacts. Webb answered immediately, expecting urgent instructions from higher command about the nationwide assault on military networks. Instead, he heard a voice that made his blood freeze in recognition. "Colonel Webb, this is Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez. I know you're dealing with the infrastructure reconnaissance operation I warned you about 18 months ago. I'm currently at the main gate, requesting immediate access to assist with threat mitigation." Webb's hand tightened around the phone receiver as his mind struggled to process what he was hearing. The voice was unmistakably Elena's, the same precise diction, The same slight accent that reflected her New Mexico childhood. The same confidence that had characterized her briefings during 6 years of exemplary service. But according to military records, Elena Vasquez had been medically discharged and stripped of her security clearances, making it impossible for her to access Pentagon communication lines or approach the base's secured perimeter. Elena, Webb said carefully, wondering if stress and exhaustion were causing auditory hallucinations. "Where are you calling from? How did you get access to a secure line?" "I'm at Gate 7 with Captain Morrison's security detail," Elena replied matter-of-factly. "I've been monitoring the attack progression for the past 6 hours and have analytical data that will help you understand what you're really facing. The reconnaissance phase is almost complete, which means you have approximately 47 minutes before they begin the primary infrastructure penetration sequence." Webb looked through his office window toward the main gate, barely visible through the storm and emergency lighting. Captain Morrison commanded the base's primary security checkpoint, responsible for controlling access during both routine operations and emergency situations. If Elena was actually at the gate, Morrison would have already contacted the command center to report an unauthorized civilian attempting to enter a military installation. During a classified crisis situation, the phone on Webb's desk rang again, displaying Morrison's direct line. Webb answered with growing confusion about what was happening at his base's security perimeter. Morrison's voice carried the professional tension of a security officer dealing with an unusual situation that didn't fit standard protocols. "Sir, I have a civilian at the gate claiming to be former Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez. She's requesting immediate access to assist with current operations and has presented identification that appears authentic. Her knowledge of ongoing activities suggests she has access to classified information about tonight's incidents." Webb felt reality shift around him as he tried to reconcile Elena's presence at the gate with her official discharge status. Military installations didn't allow former personnel with psychiatric discharge classifications to approach secured perimeters, especially during crisis situations involving potential national security threats. Yet Elena had somehow obtained access to Pentagon communication systems and was requesting entry to provide assistance with the exact scenario she'd predicted during her final service evaluation. "Patch me through to the gate security station," Webb ordered, needing to see Elena for himself before believing that she was actually standing outside Fort Brazelton's main entrance. The video feed from Gate 7 security cameras showed a woman in civilian clothing standing calmly beside Morrison's checkpoint booth, seemingly unaffected by the storm that continued to rage around the base. Even through the grainy emergency lighting and weather interference, Webb could see that the woman was unmistakably Elena Vasquez. She wore a dark jacket over practical clothing that suggested she'd prepared for both the weather and the possibility of extended analytical work. Her posture was relaxed but alert, displaying the same confident bearing that had characterized her military service. Major Coleman entered Webb's office carrying urgent reports about the escalating cyber attacks, stopping short when she saw Elena's image on the security monitor. Coleman had been present during Elena's psychiatric evaluation and discharge proceedings, making her one of the few personnel who could definitively confirm Elena's identity. "Sir, that's definitely Elena Vasquez," Coleman said with disbelief evident in her voice. "But according to her discharge documentation, she should be receiving ongoing psychiatric treatment at a veterans medical facility in Colorado. How is she here, and how does she know about tonight's operations?" Webb switched the communication feed to speak directly with Elena through the gate's intercom system. Seeing her on the security monitor had confirmed her physical presence, but hearing her voice through the base's communication network felt like communicating with a ghost who had somehow returned from administrative exile. "Elena, explain how you know about tonight's attacks and why you're here now," Webb said, watching her image on the monitor as she responded. I've been tracking the preparatory activities for this operation since my discharge, Elena replied, her voice carrying the same analytical certainty that had made her intelligence assessments legendary. The random cyber attacks over the past 18 months weren't random at all. They were systematic reconnaissance designed to map military network vulnerabilities across multiple installations. Tonight's storm-covered assault is the final intelligence gathering phase before the primary attack sequence begins. Lieutenant Peters appeared in Webb's office doorway, having abandoned her analytical station to report directly about the worsening situation. Sir, the attacks are following the progression that matches theoretical models in Vasquez's old reports. They're not trying to penetrate our networks yet. They're learning how our automated defenses respond to different intrusion types. Webb realized that Elena's presence at the gate wasn't coincidental timing, but rather the culmination of 18 months of independent analysis conducted outside official military channels. She had somehow maintained surveillance of the threats she'd identified, tracking their development despite being excluded from intelligence networks and stripped of her security clearances. Captain Rodriguez burst into the office with printouts showing attack escalation timelines. Colonel, we're seeing increased coordination between multiple adversary groups. The attacks are transitioning from reconnaissance to active penetration attempts. Our current defensive protocols aren't designed to handle this level of systematic assault. Through the security monitor, Webb watched Elena check her watch with the same methodical precision she displayed during countless intelligence briefings. She looked directly into the security camera as if she could see him watching her, then spoke with quiet urgency that cut through the chaos surrounding the command center. Colonel, you have 43 minutes before they begin targeting critical infrastructure systems that will cripple military communications across 7 states. I can help you stop them, but only if you're willing to trust the analysis you once dismissed as paranoid delusion. Webb stared at Elena's image on the monitor, remembering the woman who had saved countless lives through her analytical brilliance, the soldier whose predictions had prevented attacks that could have devastated military operations worldwide. The psychiatric evaluation that had ended her career now seemed like a catastrophic mistake that had deprived them of their most effective defense against the very threats she'd tried to warn them about. Outside the gate, Elena Vasquez waited, calmly in the storm, carrying 18 months of independent intelligence analysis about an enemy operation that was unfolding exactly as she'd predicted it would, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Colonel Webb made the decision that would either save Fort Brazelton or end his military career. Against every security protocol governing military installations during crisis situations, he authorized Elena Vasquez's immediate entry to the Strategic Intelligence Command building. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom with barely concealed concern about allowing a discharged veteran with psychiatric notations access to classified operations, but Webb's authorization overrode standard security procedures. Escort her directly to the command center, Webb ordered, watching Elena's calm progress through multiple security checkpoints on the surveillance monitors. Full access to current intelligence data and analytical systems. I'm taking personal responsibility for this decision. Major Coleman stared at Webb with the expression of someone watching her commanding officer commit professional suicide. Sir, Elena's security clearances were permanently revoked during her discharge. Even if she is who she claims to be, allowing her access to classified intelligence networks violates federal regulations that could result in court-martial proceedings. Webb understood the risks he was taking, but watching his current analytical team struggle with threats that Elena had predicted 18 months ago had convinced him that conventional protocols were inadequate for the crisis they faced. Elena's presence at the gate during the exact operation she'd warned about couldn't be explained through coincidence or lucky guessing. She had somehow maintained intelligence, capabilities that exceeded those of his officially cleared personnel. Elena entered the command center 15 minutes later, moving through the familiar space with the confidence of someone returning home after a long absence. She wore civilian clothing that looked practical rather than fashionable, dark jeans, a weatherproof jacket, and boots designed for extended standing rather than style. Her appearance was subtly different from Webb's memories of her military service, reflecting 18 months of life outside the structured environment of active duty. Lieutenant Peters looked up from her analytical station with recognition mixed with confusion. Elena appeared older, carrying herself with a certainty that seemed to have deepened during her absence from military service. Her dark hair was shorter than regulation had required, and her clothes suggested financial stability that contrasted with typical struggles of veterans dealing with psychiatric discharge classifications. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Peters said formally, unsure how to address someone whose military rank had been officially terminated. "I'm Lieutenant Peters, your replacement in the Cyber Analysis Division." Elena studied Peters' workstation with the analytical intensity that had made her legendary among intelligence personnel. Multiple monitors displayed attack progression data, threat assessment timelines, and defensive countermeasure effectiveness ratings. Elena's eyes moved systematically across the displays, absorbing information with the speed that had once allowed her to process vast amounts of intelligence data in minutes rather than hours. "You're doing solid work with limited analytical frameworks," Elena said diplomatically, recognizing Peters' competence while noting the gaps in her current threat assessment. "But you're missing the meta-patterns that connect tonight's attacks to preparatory activities conducted over the past 18 months. Sergeant Johnson approached Elena with a mixture of relief and disbelief, carrying printouts of intelligence reports that had been troubling him for weeks. Johnson had worked closely with Elena for 3 years, learning to trust her analytical methods even when they seemed to defy conventional intelligence protocols. "Elena, these attack signatures match the theoretical models you developed before." "Your discharge," Johnson said, spreading the reports across an empty workstation. "The progression patterns, the systematic vulnerability assessment, the coordination across multiple installations, everything is happening exactly as you predicted." Elena reviewed Johnson's analysis with approval, noting how her former partner had maintained some of her analytical techniques despite official pressure to adopt more conventional intelligence methods. The attack data confirmed Elena's understanding of enemy capabilities that had been dismissed as paranoid speculation during her psychiatric evaluation. The preparatory phase included 17 different testing operations disguised as random cyber attacks, Elena explained, pointing to specific data points in Johnson's reports. Each attack was designed to probe different aspects of military network defenses, mapping automated response systems and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited during a coordinated assault. Colonel Webb watched Elena work with the familiar equipment and personnel, noting how naturally she integrated back into the analytical environment that had been her professional home for 6 years. Her knowledge of current intelligence data suggested she had somehow maintained access to classified information despite her discharge and revoked security clearances. "Elena, how have you been monitoring these threats?" Webb asked directly. "Your clearances were revoked 18 months ago, and your discharge classification should have prevented any contact with intelligence networks." Elena looked at Webb with eyes that held 18 months of experiences he couldn't begin to imagine. "I've been working with an independent intelligence organization that specializes in threats conventional military analysis can't adequately address. They recruited me 3 weeks after my discharge, recognizing that my analytical capabilities weren't impaired by psychiatric conditions, but rather enhanced by cognitive patterns that exceed standard operational frameworks." Major Coleman stared at Elena with growing alarm. Are you saying you've been working for a private intelligence contractor? That could constitute violation of federal laws governing military personnel with access to classified information. I'm saying I've been working for people who understand that some threats require analytical approaches that exist outside official intelligence protocols, Elena replied calmly. The organization one work with has been tracking the enemy operation that's targeting military installations tonight. They sent me here because I'm the only analyst with sufficient knowledge of Fort Brazelton's defensive capabilities to prevent what's about to happen. Captain Rodriguez approached with urgent reports about escalating attack patterns. The intrusion attempts are becoming more sophisticated, targeting specific vulnerabilities in ways that suggest intimate knowledge of our network architecture. They're preparing for something much larger than reconnaissance. Elena accepted Rodriguez's reports and began cross-referencing them with data she carried on a secure tablet device that bore no military identification markings. The information on her tablet included intelligence assessments that seemed impossibly current and detailed, suggesting access to intelligence sources that exceeded Fort Brazelton's analytical capabilities. 31 minutes until they begin the infrastructure penetration sequence, Elena announced, her voice carrying the same confident certainty that had characterized her military briefings. The attacks you've been monitoring tonight are the final preparation phase for an operation designed to cripple military communications across the entire southeastern United States. Webb realized that Elena Vasquez had not only survived her psychiatric discharge but had somehow evolved into an intelligence asset more valuable than anything in his official personnel roster. The woman standing in his command center possessed capabilities that exceeded military analytical frameworks, carrying 18 months of knowledge about threats that his current team couldn't even properly identify. Elena's secure tablet displayed intelligence data that shouldn't have existed outside classified military networks. As she scrolled through threat assessments and attack pattern analyses, Webb noticed that her information included real-time updates about cyber intrusion attempts that were occurring at that very moment. The data wasn't just current, it was predictive, showing enemy movements and tactical decisions before they appeared on Fort Brazelton's monitoring systems. Elena, where exactly is this intelligence coming from? Webb demanded, gesturing toward her tablet. That information includes classified data about tonight's attacks that we haven't shared with any external organizations. How do you have access to intelligence that exceeds our own analytical capabilities? Elena continued working without looking up from her tablet, her fingers moving across the device with practiced efficiency as she cross-referenced enemy attack vectors with Fort Brazelton's protocols. The organization I work with has intelligence collection methods that exist outside traditional military frameworks, she said matter-of-factly. They monitor threats that conventional intelligence agencies can't see or won't acknowledge. Lieutenant Peters leaned over Elena's shoulder, trying to understand the analytical software displayed on her tablet. The interface looked unlike any intelligence platform Peters had encountered during her military training or NSA experience. The data visualization methods seemed almost alien in their sophistication, presenting complex threat relationships through three-dimensional models. That made connections obvious rather than buried in statistical analysis. What kind of organization has access to intelligence platforms like this? Peters asked, noting how Elena's analytical tools seemed generations ahead of standard military intelligence software. The kind that operates in spaces between official agencies and unofficial necessities, Elena replied cryptically, finally looking up from her tablet to address the growing questions about her mysterious employers. They recruit personnel who've been deemed unfit for conventional intelligence work but possess capabilities that exceed standard analytical frameworks. Major Coleman picked up a secure phone to contact Pentagon intelligence verification systems, intending to confirm whether Elena's claimed organization actually existed within approved intelligence community structures. After several minutes of increasingly frustrated conversations with various intelligence officials, Coleman hung up with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Sir, this is impossible," Coleman reported to Webb. "I've contacted every intelligence verification system in the Pentagon database. Some officials claim they've never heard of any organization matching Elena's description. Others refuse to discuss the matter entirely, citing classification levels that exceed my clearance authorization. 2 different offices told me that inquiries about Elena Vasquez have been flagged as requiring special handling procedures." Webb felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized that Elena's discharge from military service might have been more complicated than standard psychiatric evaluation procedures. The inconsistent responses from Pentagon officials suggested that Elena's situation involved classification levels and organizational structures that existed outside normal military intelligence hierarchies. Sergeant Johnson approached with printouts of historical intelligence reports, having spent the past 20 minutes reviewing Elena's analytical work from before her discharge. "Sir, I've been comparing Elena's predictions from 18 months ago with tonight's attack patterns. Her analytical accuracy was impossible unless she had access to enemy operational planning that doesn't exist in any intelligence database." Elena's tablet chimed with an incoming message that caused her to frown with concern as she read the encrypted text. The message appeared to be in multiple languages, including symbols that looked more like mathematical equations than traditional communication. Codes. Elena responded quickly through her tablet's secure messaging system, typing in the same hybrid language mathematics format. 26 minutes until infrastructure penetration begins, Elena announced after finishing her message exchange. "My organization is tracking coordinated preparations at 17 different military installations. Fort Brazelton is the primary target, but the enemy operation extends across multiple states and involves capabilities that your current intelligence assessments haven't identified." Captain Rodriguez monitored communication traffic from other affected military bases, noting increasingly urgent requests for analytical support that seemed focused specifically on Fort Brazelton's intelligence capabilities. "Sir, we're receiving priority requests from commanders at 3 different installations asking for analytical support from Staff Sergeant Vasquez. They're specifically requesting her by name and citing intelligence reports that reference her predictive capabilities." Webb stared at Rodriguez with growing confusion about Elena's apparent reputation among military commanders who should have no knowledge of her analytical work. Elena had been discharged 18 months ago with psychiatric notations that should have ended any official recognition of her intelligence capabilities. Yet military officials across multiple installations were somehow aware of her analytical skills and requesting her assistance with current threat assessments. "Elena, how do other military commanders know about your analytical capabilities?" Webb asked directly. "Your discharge was classified, and your psychiatric evaluation specifically recommended against any future intelligence work." Elena looked at Webb with patient expression of someone explaining obvious facts to people who lacked sufficient clearance to understand the complete picture. "Colonel, my discharge from Fort Brazelton was administrative necessity rather than genuine psychiatric impairment. The organization I work with requires personnel who exist outside official military structures, but maintain knowledge of intelligence operations and enemy capabilities." The implications of Elena's statement struck Webb like physical blow. If Elena's psychiatric discharge had been intentionally orchestrated to facilitate her recruitment by an unofficial intelligence organization, then the entire evaluation process had been elaborate deception designed to remove her from military records while preserving her analytical capabilities for classified operations. Lieutenant Peters pulled up Elena's original discharge documentation on her workstation. Reviewing the psychiatric evaluation reports, that had ended Elena's military career. The medical assessment seemed thorough and authentic, Peters reported. Multiple military psychiatrists documented paranoid delusions, stress-induced psychosis, and complete disconnection from operational reality. Effective cover stories require authentic documentation, Elena replied calmly, confirming Peters' growing suspicion that Elena's psychological evaluation had been carefully constructed fiction, rather than genuine medical assessment. The organization I work with specializes in recruiting personnel whose official discharge classifications provide perfect cover for unofficial intelligence operations. Elena's tablet displayed a new threat assessment that made her expression darken with immediate concern. The data showed enemy attack preparations reaching final coordination phase, with intrusion attempts shifting from reconnaissance to active penetration of critical infrastructure systems. Enemy forces were apparently prepared to begin the primary assault sequence that Elena had been warning about for 18 months. 22 minutes until they target communication systems that coordinate military operations across 7 states, Elena announced with urgent authority. The preparatory attacks you've been monitoring tonight were designed to map defensive responses and identify vulnerabilities that will be exploited during the primary infrastructure assault. Webb realized that Elena Vasquez had been operating for 18 months as an unofficial intelligence asset whose capabilities exceeded anything in his official personnel roster. The woman who had been discharged as mentally unstable was apparently part of an intelligence organization sophisticated enough to orchestrate elaborate cover stories while maintaining surveillance of threats that conventional military analysis couldn't adequately address. The question was no longer whether Elena could help them defend against the incoming attack. The question was whether Fort Brazelton could survive the next 22 minutes without capabilities that officially didn't exist. Elena's tablet erupted with priority alerts as intelligence data streamed in from monitoring stations that seemed to exist outside any official military network. The incoming information painted a picture of enemy coordination that exceeded every threat assessment Fort Brazelton had ever conducted. Elena's expression grew increasingly grim as she absorbed reports about synchronized attack preparations, spanning multiple time zones and targeting infrastructure systems that could cripple military operations across the entire continental United States. Colonel Webb, what you're seeing tonight isn't an isolated cyber attack on Fort Brazelton, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of intelligence that extended far beyond local base security. This is the culmination of a 3-year enemy operation designed to simultaneously disable military communication networks, logistics coordination systems, and strategic command structures across 17 different installations. Webb felt the command center around him shift into sharper focus as Elena's words revealed the true scope of the crisis they were facing. The sophisticated cyber attacks that had seemed overwhelming when directed at Fort Brazelton alone were apparently just one component of a coordinated assault designed to paralyze American military capabilities during a critical strategic window. 17 installations? Major Coleman asked, her voice tight with the realization that they were dealing with something approaching a national security emergency. Are you saying this is a precursor to invasion or major enemy offensive operations? Elena's tablet displayed a tactical map showing military bases across the southeastern United States, each marked with real-time data about ongoing cyber intrusion attempts. The visualization revealed attack coordination that seemed impossibly sophisticated, requiring intelligence about American military networks that should have been beyond any foreign adversaries' collection capabilities. Not invasion, Elena replied, manipulating the tactical display to show projected attack outcomes. Economic warfare. The enemy operation is designed to disrupt military logistics networks during the quarterly supply chain coordination period. That begins in 18 minutes. They're targeting the computational systems that coordinate equipment deliveries, personnel transfers, and strategic resource allocation across the entire southeastern military district. Lieutenant Peters stared at Elena's tactical display with growing horror as the implications became clear. Military logistics networks processed billions of dollars in strategic resources during quarterly coordination periods, managing supply chains that supported combat operations in multiple theaters. Disrupting those systems during critical coordination windows could create cascading failures that would impact military readiness for months. Sergeant Johnson pulled up classified schedules showing the quarterly logistics coordination that Elena had referenced. "She's right about the timing," Johnson confirmed. "Tonight's coordination period processes supply chain data for operations in 3 different combat theaters. If those systems are compromised during the coordination window, it could disrupt military operations worldwide." Elena's mysterious organization had apparently been tracking an enemy operation of staggering complexity and strategic sophistication. The random cyber attacks that had puzzled intelligence analysts for the past 18 months were revealed as preparatory reconnaissance for an assault designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in American military logistics networks during their most critical operational period. "Elena, how long has your organization known about this operation?" Webb demanded, struggling to understand how an unofficial intelligence group possessed strategic threat assessments that exceeded Pentagon analytical capabilities. "We've been tracking the preparatory activities since their initial reconnaissance phase began in 2021, Elena replied, scrolling through intelligence data that documented enemy planning extending back almost 3 years. "The organization I work with specializes in threats that exist in the spaces between conventional military intelligence and economic warfare. We identify operations that traditional intelligence frameworks aren't designed to recognize or address." Captain Rodriguez monitored emergency communications from affected military installations, noting increasingly urgent requests for analytical support that seemed focused on threats matching Elena's descriptions. "Sir, we're receiving priority alerts from bases in Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. They're all reporting sophisticated cyber attacks targeting logistics coordination systems." Elena's tablet chimed with an encrypted message that caused her to immediately begin typing rapid responses through secure communication channels that seemed to connect her with intelligence assets across multiple states. Her messages were brief but urgent, suggesting that her organization was coordinating defensive responses to enemy operations that conventional military intelligence couldn't adequately address. 15 minutes until the primary infrastructure assault begins, Elena announced, her fingers moving across the tablet's interface with practiced efficiency. "The enemy forces have completed their reconnaissance phase and are preparing to target computational systems that process quarterly logistics coordination. Once those systems are compromised, military supply chains will be disrupted for a minimum of 6 weeks." Webb realized that Elena's presence at Fort Brazelton wasn't coincidental timing, but rather strategic positioning by an intelligence organization that had anticipated this exact scenario. Elena had been placed at the installation best equipped to defend against the enemy operation, carrying 18 months of intelligence data that could mean the difference between successful defense and catastrophic infrastructure failure. What kind of organization has the resources to track enemy operations for 3 years while maintaining cover stories sophisticated enough to fool Pentagon intelligence verification systems? Webb asked, finally understanding that Elena's mysterious employers operated at levels of classification that existed outside his knowledge or authority. The kind that operates in the spaces between official agencies and unofficial necessities, Elena replied, using the same cryptic language that had characterized her earlier explanations. "We're funded through mechanisms that don't appear in congressional budget authorizations, staffed by personnel whose official discharge classifications provide perfect operational cover and tasked with threats that conventional intelligence agencies can't acknowledge or address. Major Coleman stared at Elena with the expression of someone discovering that her understanding of American intelligence capabilities had been fundamentally incomplete. Are you describing a parallel intelligence organization that operates outside all official oversight and accountability structures? I'm describing people who understand that some threats require responses that exist outside traditional military protocols. Elena said simply. Tonight's enemy operation was designed to exploit gaps in conventional intelligence analysis and defensive frameworks. My organization exists to address threats that fall through those gaps. Elena's tablet displayed a countdown timer showing 13 minutes and 47 seconds until the projected beginning of the primary infrastructure assault. The timer was synchronized with real-time intelligence about enemy coordination activities, suggesting that Elena's organization possessed surveillance capabilities that allowed them to monitor enemy operational planning with extraordinary precision. Colonel Webb, I need immediate access to Fort Brazelton's logistics coordination systems, Elena said with urgent authority that cut through the philosophical questions about her mysterious employers. My organization has developed countermeasures that can protect military supply chain networks, but only if they're implemented before the enemy assault begins. Webb looked at Elena Vasquez, seeing not the mentally unstable veteran described in her discharge documentation, but rather an intelligence asset, whose capabilities exceeded anything in his official personnel roster. The woman standing in his command center represented resources and knowledge that could mean the difference between successful defense and strategic disaster that would impact American military operations worldwide. With less than 14 minutes remaining before the 5U projected infrastructure assault, Webb faced a decision that would define both Fort Brazelton's survival and his own military legacy. Colonel Webb made the command decision that would either save American military logistics networks or end his career in disgrace. He authorized Elena Vasquez immediate access to Fort Brazelton's most classified systems, overriding every security protocol that governed intelligence operations during national emergencies. Elena's fingers moved across her tablet with urgent precision as Webb transmitted his personal authorization codes to grant her administrative privileges that exceeded those of most Pentagon officials. Elena, you have complete system access, Webb announced, watching her connect her mysterious tablet to Fort Brazelton's primary intelligence network through ports that shouldn't have been compatible with civilian devices. Whatever countermeasures your organization has developed, deploy them now. Elena's tablet interface transformed as it synchronized with military networks, displaying analytical capabilities that seemed generations beyond anything Fort Brazelton possessed. The device projected holographic data visualizations that filled the air above her workstation, creating three-dimensional maps of enemy attack vectors and defensive countermeasures that looked like scenes from science fiction rather than conventional intelligence work. Lieutenant Peters stared at the holographic displays with amazement that bordered on disbelief. Elena, what kind of technology is that? I've never seen analytical software that can project data visualizations without external equipment. Technology that exists in the spaces between official research and operational necessity, Elena replied, her hands moving through the holographic interface to manipulate data streams that represented military logistics networks across multiple states. My organization develops capabilities that conventional military research can't acknowledge or publicly deploy. The holographic display showed real-time enemy positioning that seemed impossible to obtain through standard intelligence collection methods. Elena's system tracked individual enemy operatives conducting cyber attacks from locations across 3 different countries, identifying specific personnel and their tactical roles in the coordinated assault. The precision of her intelligence exceeded anything Webb had seen during 23 years of military service. Major Coleman monitored secure communications from Pentagon, Intelligence officials who were receiving reports about Elena's unprecedented system access. Sir, I'm getting urgent inquiries from Washington about unauthorized network connections detected at Fort Brazelton. Multiple agencies are demanding explanations about how civilian equipment gained access to classified military systems. Tell them we're implementing emergency countermeasures under my direct authorization. Webb ordered. Watching Elena work with technology that seemed to violate basic principles of computer networking and data security. All questions about operational details will be addressed after we've neutralized the current threat. Elena's holographic interface displayed countdown timers for 17 different military installations, each showing precisely when enemy forces would begin their primary infrastructure assault. The synchronization between her intelligence and actual enemy activities was so accurate that it seemed Elena's organization possessed access to enemy operational planning in real time. 9 minutes until coordinated infrastructure penetration begins, Elena announced, her voice maintaining calm authority despite the complexity of the operations she was managing. I'm implementing defensive protocols that will protect logistics networks by creating false data pathways that redirect enemy attacks away from critical systems. Sergeant Johnson watched Elena's work with fascination and growing concern about the implications of her technological capabilities. Elena, how is your organization able to create false data pathways in military networks that enemy forces can't distinguish from authentic systems? By understanding that information warfare requires capabilities that exist outside conventional cybersecurity frameworks, Elena replied, manipulating holographic data streams that seemed to respond to her thoughts as much as her physical movements. My organization develops countermeasures based on cognitive patterns and predictive algorithms that exceed standard computational limitations. The enemy assault began exactly when Elena's countdown timers predicted, with coordinated cyber attacks, targeting military logistics networks across multiple time zones. But instead of penetrating critical systems, the enemy intrusion attempts were immediately redirected into elaborate false networks that Elena's countermeasures had created in real time. Enemy forces found themselves attacking sophisticated decoy systems that appeared authentic, but contained no actual strategic information. Captain Rodriguez monitored communications from affected military installations, noting how Elena's defensive countermeasures were protecting bases she had never visited and systems she shouldn't have known existed. Sir, installations in Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina are reporting successful defense against enemy attacks. Their logistics networks are completely protected, but they have no idea how their defensive systems were upgraded. Elena's holographic display showed enemy forces becoming increasingly frustrated as their carefully planned attack encountered defensive capabilities that seemed to anticipate their every tactical decision. The false networks Elena had created were so sophisticated that enemy operatives were spending valuable time and resources attacking systems that existed only as elaborate digital illusions. Enemy forces are realizing that their primary targets are protected, Elena reported, her hands moving through holographic interfaces to adjust defensive parameters in real time. They're attempting to shift to secondary attack vectors, but my countermeasures are adapting faster than they can modify their approach. Lieutenant Peters tried to understand how Elena's system was protecting multiple military installations simultaneously through a single tablet device. Elena, you're coordinating defensive operations across 17 different bases using equipment that shouldn't be capable of processing that much data simultaneously. Conventional equipment limitations don't apply to technology based on quantum computational frameworks and predictive cognitive modeling, Elena replied matter-of-factly, as if describing routine intelligence procedures rather than capabilities that seemed to transcend known technological limitations. Webb realized that Elena wasn't just defending Fort Brazelton, but rather orchestrating a coordinated response that was protecting American military logistics networks across multiple states. Her mysterious organization had developed countermeasures that operated at levels of sophistication that exceeded Pentagon research capabilities, deploying defensive technologies that seemed decades ahead of anything in official military inventories. Holographic display showed enemy forces abandoning their attack after encountering defensive resistance that made their carefully planned operation impossible to execute. Elena's countermeasures had not only protected American military networks but had also gathered intelligence about enemy capabilities and operational structures that could prevent future attacks. "Infrastructure assault neutralized," Elena announced. With quiet satisfaction, her holographic interface displaying successful defense confirmations from all 17 targeted installations. Military logistics networks are secure, and enemy forces have withdrawn after realizing that their operational planning was compromised from the beginning. Webb stared at Elena Vasquez, understanding that the woman standing in his command center possessed capabilities that existed far beyond anything described in her official military service record or psychiatric discharge documentation. She had single-handedly defeated an enemy operation that could have crippled American military readiness, using technology and intelligence resources that seemed impossible to explain through conventional frameworks. As the holographic displays confirmed successful defense of all 17 military installations, Elena's tablet began displaying messages that seemed to come from sources beyond conventional communication networks. The encrypted text appeared in the same hybrid language mathematics format that had characterized her earlier exchanges, but now the messages carried an urgency that suggested her mission at Fort Brazelton was reaching its conclusion. Elena typed rapid responses through her tablet's secure interface, her fingers moving across the device with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to operating under strict time constraints. Her mysterious organization was apparently recalling her from Fort Brazelton now that the immediate threat had been neutralized and American military logistics networks were secured against enemy penetration attempts. "Colonel Webb, my operational parameters here are complete," Elena announced, beginning to disconnect her tablet from Fort Brazelton's intelligence networks. "The countermeasures I've implemented will continue protecting military logistics systems for approximately 6 months, after which your standard cybersecurity protocols should be sufficient to maintain network integrity." Webb watched Elena's holographic displays fade as her tablet withdrew from military network connections, leaving behind upgraded defensive systems that seemed to have been seamlessly integrated into Fort Brazelton's existing cybersecurity infrastructure. The technology Elena had deployed would continue operating autonomously, protecting critical systems without requiring ongoing maintenance or oversight from personnel who understood how the countermeasures actually functioned. Lieutenant Peters attempted to document Elena's defensive procedures for future reference, but discovered that her tablet's interface had left no trace of the analytical software or quantum computational frameworks that had made the successful defense possible. "Elena, how can we maintain the countermeasures you've deployed if we don't understand how they operate?" "The systems I've installed will maintain themselves," Elena replied, packing her tablet into a case that looked deceptively ordinary, despite containing technology that exceeded Pentagon research capabilities. "My organization designs defensive countermeasures that operate independently of human oversight, adapting to emerging threats through predictive algorithms that exceed conventional cybersecurity limitations." Major Coleman received urgent communications from Pentagon intelligence officials demanding detailed reports about the successful defense of 17 military installations. The official inquiries focused on identifying which intelligence agencies had coordinated the defensive response and what technological resources had been deployed to achieve such comprehensive protection of critical infrastructure systems. "Sir, Washington wants complete documentation of tonight's defensive operations," Coleman reported to Webb. They're specifically asking about the civilian contractor who gained access to classified military networks and the technology that successfully repelled coordinated enemy attacks. Webb realized that Elena's presence at Fort Brazelton would be impossible to explain through official channels without exposing intelligence capabilities that weren't supposed to exist. Elena's mysterious organization operated outside conventional oversight structures, deploying resources that exceeded official military capabilities while maintaining cover stories that protected their operational secrecy. Elena approached Webb's position with the same confident bearing that had characterized her military service, but her expression carried a finality that suggested their interaction was approaching its conclusion. "Colonel, I need you to understand that official documentation of tonight's events will require certain modifications to protect operational security." "What kind of modifications?" Webb asked, though he was beginning to suspect that Elena's answer would involve the same administrative efficiency that had characterized her original psychiatric discharge, the kind that ensure continued protection of American military interests while preserving the operational security of resources that don't officially exist. Elena replied diplomatically, "My organization requires that personnel maintain cover stories that protect both individual careers and national security capabilities." Sergeant Johnson noticed that Elena's personal coffee mug, which had remained on her old workstation for 18 months as an unofficial memorial, was no longer visible among the accumulated office supplies and equipment modifications. The small, succulent plant that had somehow survived without care was also missing, leaving no trace of Elena's previous presence in the Strategic Intelligence Command building. "Elena, your coffee mug and plant are gone from your old workstation," Johnson observed with growing concern about what other evidence of Elena's presence might be disappearing. "How was that possible when they were there this morning?" Elena looked toward her former workstation with something that might have been nostalgia or might have been satisfaction at seeing loose ends properly resolved. Some traces of previous operational covers need to be eliminated to maintain security. For ongoing assignments, my organization is thorough about protecting personnel who work in classified capacities. Captain Rodriguez discovered that Elena's holographic defensive systems had left no detectable traces in Fort Brazelton's computer networks despite successfully protecting military installations across multiple states. The countermeasures continued operating with perfect efficiency, but their operational methods remained completely invisible to standard cybersecurity analysis tools. "Sir, Elena's defensive systems are protecting our networks, but our diagnostic equipment can't detect how they're operating," Rodriguez reported with technical frustration. "It's like having invisible security guards who are completely effective, but leave no evidence they exist." Elena checked her watch with the same methodical precision that had characterized her military briefings, noting that her extraction timeline was approaching its scheduled conclusion. Her mysterious organization apparently operated according to strict protocols that required personnel to conclude their assignments within specific timeframes, regardless of ongoing strategic developments or personal relationships. "My transportation will arrive in approximately 8 minutes," Elena announced, gathering the few personal items she had brought to Fort Brazelton. "Colonel Webb, I want you to know that serving under your command was the most meaningful period of my military career. The analytical skills I developed here enabled everything I've accomplished since my discharge." Webb felt something fundamental shift as he realized that Elena Vasquez would soon disappear from his life again, returning to intelligence operations that existed outside his knowledge or authority. The woman who had saved American military logistics networks would fade back into administrative obscurity, leaving behind only the results of her intervention and questions that would never be officially answered. Elena approached the command center exit with purposeful steps that suggested she had already mentally transitioned from Fort Brazelton operations to whatever assignment awaited her next. Her mysterious organization had successfully deployed one of their most valuable assets to neutralize a strategic threat, and now Elena was returning to intelligence work that operated in the spaces between official agencies and unofficial necessities. As Elena reached the door, Webb realized that he was watching the departure of someone whose capabilities exceeded anything in his official personnel roster. Someone whose psychiatric discharge had been elaborate cover for intelligence work that protected American interests through methods that couldn't be officially acknowledged or documented. Elena paused at the command center doorway, turning back toward Webb with an expression that seemed to contain 18 months of experiences you would never fully understand. The storm outside had begun to subside, lightning strikes becoming less frequent as the supernatural weather patterns that had provided cover for the enemy operation gradually returned to normal atmospheric conditions. "Colonel Webb, there's something you need to know about tonight's operation," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she was about to reveal information that would change his understanding of everything that had transpired. The enemy forces weren't just targeting American military logistics networks. They were testing our defensive capabilities in preparation for something much larger. Webb felt cold certainty settle in his chest as Elena's words confirmed his growing suspicion that tonight's successful defense had been only the first phase of a conflict that extended far beyond the immediate crisis at Fort Brazelton. Elena's mysterious organization had apparently positioned her at the installation that would face the initial assault, knowing that her intervention would be crucial to protecting broader American strategic interests. "What kind of larger operation?" Webb asked, though he suspected Elena's answer would raise more questions than it resolved. "The kind that requires ongoing vigilance from people who exist outside official intelligence structures," Elena replied, checking her watch one final time. "My organization will continue monitoring emerging threats, deploying assets like me when conventional military capabilities prove insufficient to address strategic challenges." Through the command center windows, Webb could see approaching headlights that seemed to appear from nowhere, moving across the base's secured perimeter without triggering any security alarms or checkpoint protocols. Elena's extraction was apparently being conducted with the same administrative efficiency that had characterized her mysterious arrival and access to classified systems. Lieutenant Peters looked up from her workstation with sudden concern as her computer displays began showing anomalies in Elena's personnel records. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Vasquez's service documentation is showing inconsistencies. Her discharge classification keeps changing between different database entries." Elena smiled with quiet satisfaction as she watched Peter struggle to access stable information about her military service record. Administrative records require periodic updates to maintain operational security for personnel who work in classified capacities. "My organization ensures that documentation remains appropriately vague." Major Coleman attempted to access Elena's discharge documentation through Pentagon verification systems, but discovered that her security clearances were insufficient to retrieve information about Elena's psychiatric evaluation or current employment status. "Sir, Elena's records are being protected by classification levels that exceed my authorization. Even her medical discharge documentation is now marked as requiring special handling procedures." Webb realized that Elena's presence at Fort Brazelton would soon become impossible to document through official channels, leaving behind only the successful defense of American military networks and questions that would never be officially answered. Elena's mysterious organization operated with administrative sophistication that could alter military records while preserving the operational results of their personnel's interventions. "Sergeant." Johnson noticed that Elena's coffee mug had reappeared on her former workstation, but now it bore no identifying marks or personal significance. The faded photograph of their old crew had also returned, but the image showed only standard military personnel without Elena's distinctive presence among the group. Even physical evidence of Elena's military service was being systematically modified to protect her operational security. "Elena, why are your personal effects changing?" Johnson asked with growing amazement at the thoroughness of her organization's security protocols. "Because some operational covers require complete integration with official records," Elena replied, moving toward the exit as her extraction vehicle completed its approach to the command center. "My organization ensures that personnel can return to previous assignments without leaving traces that compromise ongoing intelligence operations." Captain Rodriguez discovered that the defensive systems Elena had deployed were beginning to integrate seamlessly with Fort Brazelton's existing cybersecurity infrastructure, becoming indistinguishable from standard military protection protocols. Elena's quantum computational frameworks were apparently designed to fade into conventional systems after completing their protective functions. Elena reached the command center exit just as her extraction team arrived in vehicles that bore no military identification markings but moved with precision that suggested official authorization. The personnel who stepped out to escort Elena looked like standard government contractors, dressed in practical clothing that could blend into any civilian environment. "Colonel Webb," Elena said as her extraction team waited respectfully outside the command center, "I want you to remember that some promises transcend official recognition or administrative documentation. The work we did together will continue, protecting American interests even when the people responsible can't be officially acknowledged." Webb followed Elena toward the exit, wanting to understand how someone could serve with such distinction while existing outside conventional military structures. "Elena, will I ever see you again? Will I know if you're still out there protecting people?" Elena looked back at the Strategic Intelligence Command building, where she had developed the analytical skills that made her invaluable to her mysterious organization. "You'll know we're still working when threats that seem impossible to predict are neutralized before they can cause harm. You'll see our influence and defensive capabilities that exceed official technological limitations and intelligence successes that can't be explained through conventional analytical frameworks." As Elena departed with her extraction team, Webb found a handwritten note on his desk that hadn't been there moments before. The note was written in Elena's distinctive handwriting, but the paper looked aged and weathered as if it had been carried for months rather than written recently. "Colonel Webb," the note read, "some soldiers continue serving long after their official discharge, protecting people who will never know their names. The defensive systems I've deployed will adapt to emerging threats for years to come, ensuring that American military networks remain secure against capabilities that conventional cybersecurity can't address. Thank you for believing in analytical methods that exist outside standard intelligence protocols. The mission continues, even when the personnel responsible remain officially invisible. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, proudly serving in capacities that don't officially exist." Webb looked through his office window toward the main gate, but Elena's extraction vehicles had already disappeared into the night, leaving no trace of their presence except tire tracks that seemed to fade even as he watched. The storm had completely subsided, leaving clear skies that revealed stars obscured for months by atmospheric interference that might not have been entirely natural. The next morning, Webb found that Elena's name had been quietly added to a memorial plaque in the Strategic Intelligence Command building, listed among personnel whose contributions to national security couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The inscription reads simply, "For those who serve in the spaces between official recognition and essential protection." Military logistics networks across 17 states continued operating with perfect security, protected by defensive systems that adapted to emerging threats with supernatural efficiency. And somewhere in the spaces between official agencies and unofficial necessities, Elena Vasquez continued analyzing patterns that others couldn't see, protecting people who would never know her name. 5 years later, Colonel Webb had been promoted to Pentagon Intelligence Oversight, where he regularly reviewed threat assessments that seemed impossibly accurate, yet originated from sources that couldn't be officially verified. Cyber attacks that should have crippled military operations were consistently neutralized by defensive systems that appeared overnight, operated with perfect efficiency, and left no trace of their creators. Webb kept Elena's handwritten note in his desk drawer, pulling it out whenever intelligence successes seemed too sophisticated to explain through conventional frameworks. Young analysts would ask about defensive capabilities that exceeded their training, and Webb would simply tell them that some of the best intelligence work happened in places that didn't appear on organizational charts. Lieutenant Peters, now Captain Peters, had become Fort Brazelton's senior intelligence analyst, developing intuitive pattern recognition skills that reminded Webb of Elena's analytical methods. Peters never mentioned the night Elena had returned, but she sometimes paused at the memorial plaque honoring personnel whose contributions couldn't be publicly acknowledged, as if remembering someone who had taught her that true service transcended official recognition. The coffee mug still sat on Elena's former workstation, now used by rotating analysts who treated it with unconscious reverence. Staff members claimed the workstation seemed to generate better analytical insights than others, though no one could explain why. Occasionally, Webb would find detailed threat assessments on his desk that addressed emerging dangers with uncanny accuracy, written in handwriting that looked familiar but couldn't be definitively identified. Elena Vasquez had proven that sometimes the people dismissed as broken are actually the ones who see threats that others can't recognize. Her story reminds us that true dedication to protecting others doesn't end with discharge papers or psychiatric evaluations. It transforms into something that operates beyond official recognition, but never stops serving. What do you think about Elena's story? Have you ever known someone whose true value wasn't recognized until it was almost too late? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the hidden heroes who protect us in ways we'll never fully understand. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible tales of service, sacrifice, and second chances.